November 2nd, 1944. Forward Staging Area, Nancy, France. General George S. Patton, Jr. stood in the mud, watching the column of M4 Sherman tanks roll past his position. His Third Army was preparing for one of the most ambitious offensives of the European campaign, a push through the Siegfried Line that would carry American forces deep into Germany. Patton needed every tank he could get. And that's why he was standing in freezing rain, watching a battalion he'd explicitly said he didn't want. The 761st Tank Battalion. All black. Every enlisted man, every tank commander, every gunner and driver. The only white men in the entire unit were a handful of officers who'd been assigned against their will. Patton's views on black soldiers were well documented. He'd written letters calling them inferior combat material. He'd testified before Congress that colored troops lacked the courage and intelligence for frontline combat. He'd built his reputation leading white divisions, and he wanted to keep it that way. But this was November 1944, and Patton's Third Army was bleeding. The German resistance had stiffened. His tank battalions were under strength. The replacement system couldn't keep up with losses. When Supreme Headquarters offered him the 761st, the only trained black tank battalion in Europe, Patton had no choice but to accept. What happened over the next 183 days would force Patton to do something he rarely did: admit he was wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the white commander of the 761st, watched Patton approach. Bates had trained these men for 2 years. He'd fought the Army bureaucracy to get them overseas. He'd endured threats and hate mail for treating his black tankers as equals. He knew what they were capable of. Patton knew only what his prejudices told him. The general climbed onto the hood of a jeep so the assembled tankers could see him. His pearl-handled revolvers gleamed at his hips. His face was set in the expression that had intimidated countless soldiers. "Men," Patton began, his voice carrying across the motor pool, "you're the first Negro tankers ever to fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then his expression hardened. "I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down." The tankers stood at attention, silent. They'd heard these speeches before, white officers telling them they had something to prove, that they represented their entire race, that failure meant validating every racist assumption. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers stood in the front rank, jaw clenched. He'd enlisted in 1942, determined to fight. The Army had tried to make him a cook, a stevedore, anything but a combat soldier. He'd fought the right to climb into a tank and face the enemy. Now a 3-star general was telling him not to embarrass his race. Rivers exchanged a glance with his crew. They were thinking the same thing. Prove it in combat. Let the results speak. Within 3 weeks, the 761st Tank Battalion would save Patton's entire offensive from collapse. Within 6 months, they would compile a combat record that exceeded every white tank battalion in the European theater. And Patton, the general who didn't believe black men could fight, would call them the best tank battalion he had ever seen. This is the story of how 676 black tankers shattered every assumption about race and combat. This is the story of 183 consecutive days of frontline combat without relief, longer than any other American tank unit in the war. This is the story of 30 towns liberated, 4 countries fought through, and 1 general's transformation from bigot to believer. This is the story America didn't tell for 57 years. To understand what the 761st accomplished, you have to understand the obstacles they faced before they ever reached Europe. In 1942, the United States Army operated under a policy that was simple and absolute. Black Americans could serve, but they couldn't fight. They could load ships, build roads, cook meals, and bury bodies, but they couldn't be trusted with weapons, vehicles, or combat roles. The reasoning, documented in thousands of pages of Army bureaucracy, was presented as scientific fact. A 1925 Army War College study, still being referenced in 1942, concluded that the Negro is profoundly superstitious, morally obtuse, mentally inferior, and lacks courage under fire. Tank warfare, according to Army doctrine, required split-second decisions, complex mechanical knowledge, and courage under extreme stress. Everything, the Army insisted, that black men lacked. But pressure was building. Black newspapers demanded combat roles. Civil rights organizations filed lawsuits. Eleanor Roosevelt publicly questioned why black Americans couldn't fight for their country. And most pragmatically, the Army was running out of white men. The solution, as with the Tuskegee Airmen, was to create a test case. One black tank battalion. Train them, send them to combat, and when they inevitably fail, use that failure to justify continued segregation. They activated the 761st Tank Battalion on April 1, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. April Fool's Day. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Camp Claiborne was deep in Jim Crow territory, where black soldiers faced hostility not just from white civilians, but from white soldiers and officers. The town of Alexandria, nearest to the base, was a powder keg of racial tension. Black soldiers who ventured into town risked beatings, arrests, or worse. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, a farm boy from Oklahoma, arrived at Camp Claiborne expecting to serve his country. What he found was a nation that despised him. Years later, Rivers' sister would recall his letters home. He wrote that white soldiers called them every name you can imagine, that officers told them they'd never see combat because colored boys didn't have the brains to operate tanks, that military police would arrest black soldiers for looking at white people wrong. He said the only thing that kept him going was the crew. They had each other. The 761st's early training was sabotaged at every level. They received worn-out M3 Stuart light tanks, obsolete vehicles that were being phased out of frontline service. When they finally got M4 Shermans, the tanks were the oldest models, worn from previous units' training exercises. They were denied ammunition for gunnery practice, told the ranges were reserved for priority units. When they finally got range time, they received half the ammunition allowance that white tank battalions got. Their training officers were often men who'd been rejected by white units, incompetent, disciplinary problems, or open racists who saw the 761st as a punishment detail. But Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates was different. Bates, a white officer from California, had requested command of the 761st. Not because he was assigned, not because he had no other options, because he believed the entire premise of segregation was morally bankrupt and militarily stupid. In 1943, requesting to lead black troops was career suicide for a white officer. Bates did it anyway. He fought for better equipment. He demanded equal training time. When ammunition was denied, he acquired it through unofficial channels. When racist officers tried to undermine his men, he had them transferred. When local businesses refused to serve his soldiers, he put those establishments off limits to all personnel. The Army bureaucracy tried to remove him 3 times. Each time, Bates's superiors discovered that the 761st's training scores were the highest in their division. Hard to justify removing a commander whose unit was outperforming everyone else. By late 1943, the 761st Tank Battalion was ready for combat. They'd completed advanced training, they'd earned top marks in gunnery, tactics, and maintenance. They were requesting deployment. The Army said no. For 9 months, the 761st sat at Camp Hood, Texas, fully trained and combat-ready, while white tank battalions with inferior training scores shipped to Europe. The message was clear. Black soldiers could train, but they couldn't be trusted in actual combat. Then came Operation Overlord, D-Day, June 6, 1944. American forces stormed Normandy and began the liberation of Europe. Tank losses were catastrophic. Within weeks, the replacement system was overwhelmed. Trained tank crews were in desperately short supply. Finally, in August 1944, the Army relented. The 761st Tank Battalion received deployment orders. They would join Patton's Third Army in France as part of the drive toward Germany. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers wrote home one last time before shipping out. "We're finally going to fight. Everything we've endured, all the training, all the hatred, it was preparation for this. We're going to show them what we can do. We're going to make them eat their words." The 761st Tank Battalion landed at Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944. 4 months after D-Day, the beach was no longer a combat zone, but a massive logistics operation. Mountains of supplies, rivers of vehicles, and thousands of white soldiers who stared at the black tankers with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Captain Johnny Stevens, commanding Charlie Company, recalled the reception. "We'd pull into a staging area, and white units would literally move away from us, like we were contaminated. We'd ask for maintenance support, and they told the mechanics were busy. We'd request fuel and be put at the back of the line behind units that had arrived after us. The racism wasn't subtle, it was the official policy. And the worst part was knowing we'd have to be twice as good just to be considered half as capable."
On November 2, 1944, 3 weeks after landing in France, the 761st received their assignment: join Patton's Third Army for the November offensive through Lorraine toward the German border. That's when Patton gave his speech, when he told them not to let him down, when he made it clear he hadn't asked for them and didn't want them, but he'd use them anyway. The tankers of the 761st didn't argue. They'd been arguing for 2 years, with their training scores, with their performance, with every metric the Army used to evaluate soldiers. None of it had mattered. Now they would argue with combat. The mathematics were simple. If they failed, it would prove the Army right. Segregation would continue. Black soldiers would remain in support roles forever. But if they succeeded, if they proved themselves equal or superior to white tankers, maybe something would change. It was an impossible burden, but they'd carried it since the day they enlisted. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers climbed into his Sherman tank, call sign Cool Stud, and prepared for combat. He'd waited 2.5 years for this moment. Now he would prove that courage and capability had nothing to do with skin color. Within 72 hours, the 761st would face their first major engagement, and Patton would begin to understand that his assumptions about black soldiers were about to be demolished by reality. November 8, 1944, Morville-les-Vicq, France. The 761st Tank Battalion's first combat mission was designed to be straightforward: support the 26th Infantry Division in clearing the town of Morville, a small French village the Germans were using as a supply depot. Intelligence estimated light resistance, maybe a company of rear area troops, some anti-tank guns. Nothing a veteran tank battalion couldn't handle in a few hours. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The Germans had reinforced Morville with elements of the 11th Panzer Division, hardened veterans from the Eastern Front, equipped with Panther tanks and dug-in anti-tank positions. They turned the town into a fortress, determined to hold every meter of ground. Lieutenant Colonel Bates received the mission briefing at 0600 hours. Attack at 08. He had 2 hours to brief his company commanders and position his tanks. When Captain Johnny Stevens asked what kind of resistance to expect, the infantry major running the briefing shrugged. "They're your first action. Should be easy enough for a green unit. Don't screw it up." The racial subtext was clear. "We're giving you an easy mission because we don't trust you. Don't embarrass yourselves. At 7:55 hours, Charlie Company, 16 M4 Sherman tanks in 2 platoons rode toward Moorville through early morning fog. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers commanded the lead tank, his crew tense and ready. Rivers had studied tank tactics obsessively during training. He knew the doctrine: tanks advance behind infantry, provide fire support, avoid unsupported attacks against prepared positions, the textbook approach. But Rivers also understood something the textbooks didn't mention. The 761st was being watched. Every mistake would be magnified. Every casualty would be used as evidence that black men couldn't handle combat. Their first engagement would define how the Army saw them for the rest of the war. They had to succeed, completely, overwhelmingly. At 002 hours, Rivers' tank rounded a curve and the fog lifted. He saw Moorville spread across the valley below. Church steeple in the center, stone buildings lining cobblestone streets, peaceful, quiet. Then every German position opened fire simultaneously. The first 88mm anti-tank round passed within inches of Rivers' turret, the distinctive crack of a near miss that every tanker learns to recognize instantly. The second round struck the Sherman behind him, penetrating the hull and igniting ammunition. The tank exploded, killing the entire crew in seconds. Rivers' radio erupted with voices, commanders calling targets, gunners reporting enemy positions, wounded men screaming. The carefully planned assault had dissolved into chaos in less than 30 seconds. This was the moment the Army expected the 761st to break. Green troops, first combat, taking casualties immediately, facing opposition far heavier than briefed. Every factor pointed to withdrawal and regrouping. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers made a different calculation. All cool stud elements push through the fire. Don't stop, don't retreat. Find cover and engage targets. His voice on the radio was steady, calm, like he was discussing the weather. Rivers' tank accelerated toward Moorville, its 75mm gun transversing to engage German positions. His gunner, Corporal William McBurney, fired 3 rounds in 15 seconds. 2 struck German anti-tank positions. The third blew apart a machine gun nest.
The other tanks of Charlie Company followed Rivers' lead, pushing forward through murderous fire. They used terrain for cover, fired on the move, supported each other's advances with covering fire. Everything they'd learned in training, executed under combat conditions with near-perfect precision. The German defenders had expected the black tankers to panic, to retreat after taking the first casualties, to prove they didn't belong in combat. Instead, they faced tankers who fought with calculated aggression that bordered on recklessness. Within 30 minutes, Charlie Company had destroyed or suppressed every German anti-tank position on the approaches to Moorville. Then Rivers did something that wasn't in the tactical playbook. He called for infantry support, and when told the infantry were delayed, he ordered his tanks into the town without them. Tanks advancing into urban terrain without infantry support violated every tactical doctrine the Army taught. German infantry with Panzerfausts could hide in buildings and destroy tanks at point-blank range. It was suicide. Rivers saw a different calculation. If they waited for infantry, the Germans would reorganize their defenses, the momentum would be lost, and most critically, hesitation would be interpreted as cowardice. The first time black tankers faced serious opposition, they stopped and waited for white infantry to save them. Not acceptable. Cool Stud 1 entering the town. Follow my lead. Watch for Panzerfausts. Rivers' Sherman rolled into Moorville's main street, turret traversing constantly, searching for threats. German infantry were everywhere, in windows, behind walls, in basements. Rivers' crew engaged them with machine gun fire and high explosive shells. The fighting was brutal and intimate. German soldiers threw magnetic mines at passing tanks. American tankers fired point-blank into buildings. The narrow streets funneled movement into kill zones that both sides exploited ruthlessly. But the 761st had one advantage the Germans didn't expect. They were better tankers. Their gunnery was precise. Their crew coordination was seamless. Their tactical decisions were aggressive but not suicidal. These weren't green troops stumbling through their first combat. These were warriors who trained longer and harder than any white tank unit because they had to be undeniably excellent. By 1400 hours, 6 hours after the first shot, Morville was secure. Charlie Company controlled the town. German forces had withdrawn, leaving behind destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and dozens of casualties. The 761st's casualties? 1 tank destroyed in the initial ambush, 5 tanks damaged but repairable, 4 men killed, 11 wounded. For a green unit's first combat against a fortified position defended by veteran troops, the results were remarkable. For a black unit that the Army insisted was inferior combat material, the results were impossible. Captain Johnny Stevens radioed the after-action report to headquarters. The response was silence. Then, after a few minutes, a different voice came on the radio. Smoother, more educated. Staff officer, probably. Charlie Company, confirm your casualty report. Did you say 4 KIA? Affirmative. 4 killed, 11 wounded. 1 tank total loss. Another pause. And the town is secure? Affirmative. German forces withdrew 2 hours ago. We're consolidating positions and treating wounded. Understood. Good work. The officer sounded confused, like the results didn't match what he had expected. Because they didn't. The Army had expected the 761st to fail, or at minimum, to succeed at a terrible cost that would prove they didn't belong in combat. Instead, they'd executed a difficult urban assault with minimal casualties and complete success. That evening, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers and his crew sat on the hull of their Sherman, eating cold rations and smoking cigarettes. They were exhausted, shell-shocked, processing the fact that they'd survived their first battle. Private Samuel Turley, Rivers' loader, broke the silence. "We did good today, didn't we, Sarge?" Rivers nodded slowly. "We did what we trained for, nothing more." "But we proved something, right? Prove we can fight?" Rivers took a long drag on his cigarette. "We proved it to ourselves, but the Army will have to keep proving it. Every mission, every engagement. One good day isn't enough." He was right.
Over the next 2 weeks, the 761st fought in 13 separate engagements. They cleared towns, they destroyed German strongpoints, they supported infantry advances through some of the most difficult terrain in France. And every single mission, they succeeded. November 16th, 1944, Dieuze, France. The town of Dieuze sat on critical road junctions that Patton's Third Army needed to continue its advance toward the German border. German forces were defending it with 2 companies of infantry, multiple anti-tank positions, and, most dangerously, several self-propelled assault guns that could destroy Sherman tanks at long range. The 26th Infantry Division had tried to take Dieuze twice. Both assaults had failed, with heavy casualties. The Germans were too well dug in, their positions too strong. Patton's staff proposed bypassing Dieuze and attacking around it. Patton refused. He wanted the road junctions. He wanted the supplies stored there. And he wanted a victory to maintain his offensive's momentum. Someone suggested using the 761st. The reaction in Patton's headquarters was immediate skepticism. The Negro Battalion? They've been in combat for 2 weeks. This requires veteran troops. But Patton had been reading the 761st's after-action reports. Morville, Vic-sur-Seille, Château-Salon. Every mission was successful. Casualties lower than comparable white units. Enemy equipment destroyed exceeding intelligence estimates. The numbers didn't lie. And Patton, for all his faults, was a general who paid attention to combat results. "Give it to Bates and his boys," Patton ordered. "If they can't take it, nobody can." Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates received the order at 1800 hours on November 15th. Attack at dawn. No air support available, bad weather.
Artillery support limited. Shells were being rationed for a major offensive elsewhere. Infantry support was minimal. The 26th Division was exhausted from previous assaults. In other words, the 761st would take Dios essentially alone against defenses that had repelled 2 previous attacks by larger forces with better support. Bates studied intelligence maps and reconnaissance photos. The German positions were expertly placed. Any direct approach would be suicidal. The assault guns could engage at ranges where Sherman tanks would be destroyed before they could return effective fire. He called his company commanders together for planning. Captain David Williams, Captain Johnny Stevens, Captain Charles Wingo. Officers who'd led their men through 2 weeks of continuous combat and knew their crew's capabilities intimately. "Gentlemen," Bates began, spreading the maps across a makeshift table, "they're giving us the mission the white units failed. We all know why. If we fail, it proves their point. If we succeed," he trailed off. "If we succeed, they'll say the Germans were already weakened. We can't win this politically, but we can win it militarily." "Which is all that matters," Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers added from where he stood in the back. He wasn't supposed to be at the officer briefing, but Bates had started inviting senior NCOs. Their tactical insights were too valuable to ignore. Rivers stepped forward to the map. "The direct approaches are death traps, but here," he pointed to a wooded area east of Dioth, "the terrain provides cover almost to the town's edge. If we move at night, we can be in position before dawn, hit them from an unexpected direction while they're watching the main roads." It was a risky plan. Night movement in tanks was difficult and dangerous, but it offered the element of surprise. Bates made the decision. "We go with Rivers' plan. Night movement, attack at first light from the east." At 0200 hours on November 16th, the 761st tanks began moving toward their assault positions. They traveled without lights, drivers using moonlight and memory to navigate narrow forest trails. Several tanks got stuck, 2 through tracks in the darkness. But by 0600 hours, 31 Sherman tanks were positioned in the tree line 400 meters from Dioz's eastern edge, exactly where the Germans weren't looking. At 0630, as dawn broke across frozen fields, Rivers' voice crackled across the battalion radio net. "All cool stud elements, execute!" 31 Sherman tanks erupted from the forest simultaneously, a wave of steel and fire that caught the German defenders completely by surprise. The assault guns that had dominated previous battles were positioned to cover the western approaches. They never got a chance to turn. The 761st destroyed 3 assault guns in the first 5 minutes. Their crews, trained to perfection, worked like machine-like efficiency. Gunners acquired targets, loaders slammed shells into breaches, commanders called adjustments, drivers maneuvered to optimal firing positions.
German infantry tried to organize a defense, but the surprise had been total. Within 30 minutes, American tanks were in Dieu's streets. By 0900 hours, the town was secure. The entire battle had lasted 2.5 hours. Casualties? 2 tanks damaged, 0 destroyed. 3 men wounded, 0 killed. When the after-action report reached Patton's headquarters, the general read it twice. Then he picked up the phone and called Bates directly. "Colonel, did your boys really take Deuce in 2.5 hours?" "Yes, sir. Complete surprise. Textbook execution." Patton was silent for several seconds. "The 26th Infantry tried twice and got their asses handed to them. You're telling me your battalion," he caught himself, "did in 2 hours what an entire division couldn't do in a week?" "That's correct, sir." Another pause. Then, "I'm coming to see you." On November 18, 1944, General George S. Patton visited the 761st Tank Battalion's position near Dieu's. He didn't send a subordinate. He didn't ask for a formal ceremony. He just showed up in his Jeep with his aide and walked through the tank park, talking to crews.
Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was performing maintenance on Cool Stud when Patton approached. Rivers snapped to attention, expecting a formal inspection. "At ease, Sergeant." Patton studied the tank, its battle scars, the kill rings painted on the barrel, the efficiency of Rivers' crew. "This is your tank?" "Yes, sir." "How many engagements?" 15, sir, since November 8th. "That's damn near one per day." Patton's expression was unreadable. "You boys have been busy." "We go where we're sent, sir." Patton nodded slowly. Then he did something that shocked everyone watching. He extended his hand to Rivers, a 3-star general, offering to shake hands with a black NCO. Rivers hesitated for just a moment, then shook. Patton's grip was firm. "I was wrong about you," Patton said quietly, quiet enough that only Rivers and the immediately nearby soldiers could hear. "I didn't think—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "I had assumptions. They were wrong. You and your men are as fine as soldiers as I've ever seen." Rivers didn't know what to say. Patton saved him from responding by turning to address the assembled tankers. "Men, I came here to tell you something. The 761st Tank Battalion is now my go-to unit. When I have a tough mission, when I need something done right, I'm sending you. Not because you're Negro, not because of politics, because you're the best damn tank outfit in my army." The tankers stood in silence. They'd heard speeches before. They'd heard white officers praise them to their faces and demean them behind their backs. But something about Patton's tone, grudging, almost angry that he had to admit it, made this feel different. This felt real. "Don't let it go to your heads," Patton continued, his voice harder now. "You've had a good couple weeks, but this war isn't over. I expect you to maintain this performance. I expect you to continue being the best. Understood?" "Yes, sir." The answer echoed across the motor pool. Patton climbed back into his Jeep. As he drove away, he turned to his aide. "Make a note. I want the 761st attached directly to 12th Corps. Whatever missions come up that need reliable tanks, they get first call." "Sir, are you sure? The Army brass might—" "I don't give a damn what the Army brass thinks. Those boys just did what an entire white division couldn't do. Combat results are the only thing that matters in war, and they get results." Word of Patton's visit spread quickly through both the 761st and the broader Third Army. White units that had been hostile or dismissive suddenly became professional. Supply officers who'd lost requisitions suddenly found them. Maintenance units that had been too busy suddenly had time. Not because hearts changed, because Patton had made it clear. The 761st was valuable, and in the military hierarchy, what the commanding general values, everyone values. But the real test was still coming. November 19th, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was coming, though nobody knew it yet. For the 761st Tank Battalion, what followed would become the longest sustained combat operation by any American tank unit in World War II. 183 consecutive days on the line without relief. To understand what that means, most tank battalions rotated off the line every 30 to 45 days for rest, refit, and replacements. The physical and psychological stress of armored combat required periodic breaks. Crews needed sleep. Tanks needed maintenance. Men needed time to process the trauma of watching friends die. The 761st would get none of that.
From November 7, 1944 through May 6, 1945, the day before Germany surrendered, the 761st fought continuously. They were committed to every major engagement in Patton's sector. When other units withdrew to rest, the 761st moved to different sectors and kept fighting. The reason was simple and ugly. They were expendable in a way white units weren't. The Army could push them harder, risk them more freely because black casualties didn't generate the same political pressure as white casualties. But there was another factor the Army didn't anticipate. The 761st refused to fail. By December 1944, they'd liberated 18 French towns. By January 1945, they'd pushed into Belgium and Luxembourg. By March, they were in Germany itself. The statistics tell part of the story. 30-plus towns and villages liberated. 4 countries fought through: France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany. 6,000-plus miles traveled under combat conditions. 131,000-plus gallons of fuel consumed. 35,000-plus rounds of ammunition fired. But statistics can't capture what 1,800 consecutive days of combat does to human beings. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers would never see the end of the war. On November 16th, the same day the 761st took Diez, Rivers' tank hit a mine during a reconnaissance mission. The explosion wounded Rivers in the leg, a painful injury that should have sent him to a field hospital. He refused medical evacuation. For the next 3 days, Rivers commanded his tank with an untreated leg wound that was becoming infected. His crew begged him to get medical treatment. He refused. They had a mission. They were undermanned. He wasn't leaving. On November 19th, near the town of Gwebling, Rivers' company ran into a German roadblock, 3 anti-tank guns supported by infantry. The position was blocking the entire American advance. Rivers, limping and fever-weak from infection, climbed into his tank one last time. "I'll take points," he radioed. "Follow my lead." His crew protested. Captain David Williams ordered him to stand down. Rivers ignored the order and accelerated toward the German position. What happened next was witnessed by 24 American tankers and would eventually earn Rivers a Medal of Honor, though not until 1997, 53 years after his death. Rivers' Sherman tank charged the German position alone, drawing fire from all 3 anti-tank guns. His turret was hit twice, but he kept firing, destroying 1 German gun before a 3rd round penetrated his tank's hull. The Sherman erupted in flames. Rivers and his crew never got out. But his sacrifice had drawn the German fire long enough for the rest of Charlie Company to flank and destroy the position. The advance continued. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers died proving black soldiers could be heroes. The Army, in 1944, decided his sacrifice wasn't worth a Medal of Honor. He received a Silver Star, 2 levels lower, and was quickly forgotten. Rivers wasn't the only hero the 761st produced during those 183 days. Sergeant Warren G. Creasy would single-handedly destroy 3 German tanks, 6 pillboxes, and multiple machine gun nests during a single engagement near Siltz, Germany. He'd operate his tank's 50-caliber machine gun while exposed in the turret, suppressing German positions so infantry could advance. Technician 5th grade Horace Evans would drive his tank through a minefield to rescue wounded infantrymen trapped under German fire. His tank hit 2 mines. He kept driving until the infantry were safe. First Lieutenant Charles Thomas would lead his tanks against a fortified German position despite being wounded 3 times. He'd stay in combat for 4 days with untreated wounds rather than leave his men. Each of these men would eventually receive recognition, but not until decades after the war. In 1944 and 1945, their heroism was filed away, their achievements minimized, because acknowledging them meant acknowledging that black soldiers were equals. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, began on December 16, 1944. German forces punched through American lines in Belgium, creating a massive salient that threatened to split Allied forces. The 761st was already exhausted from 6 weeks of continuous combat. They'd lost tanks, they'd lost men, they needed rest. Instead, Patton ordered them north to help contain the German breakthrough. On December 31, 1944, the 761st counterattacked German positions at Tillet, Belgium. The temperature was below zero. The snow was 3 feet deep. Their tanks could barely move through the frozen terrain. They attacked anyway.
Captain Charles Wingo, commanding Baker Company, led the assault. His after-action report described conditions that would have broken most units. Visibility near zero due to blowing snow. German positions camouflaged. Our tanks breaking through ice into streams. Men suffering from frostbite, exhaustion, and combat fatigue. We attacked because we were ordered to attack, because that's what soldiers do. The 761st helped break the German offensive at Tillet, then immediately moved to another sector and fought at Baston's perimeter, then moved again to attack German positions near Houffalize. They'd been in combat for 75 consecutive days. No rest, no rotation, no relief. White tank battalions that had been in combat for half that time were being pulled back, declared combat ineffective, sent to rear areas for reconstitution. The 761st kept fighting. By March 1945, they'd pushed into Germany itself. The fighting grew more desperate as German forces defended their homeland. Hitler had issued orders, no retreat, fight to the last man. The 761st fought through the Siegfried Line, Germany's defensive fortifications along its western border. They fought through German towns that had been turned into fortresses. They fought German troops who knew they were fighting for survival. On March 21, 1945, the 761st reached the Rhine River, the last major obstacle before Germany's industrial heartland. They'd traveled further, fought longer, and lost more men than any comparable tank unit in the European theater, and they were still fighting. The Rhine crossing was one of the most difficult operations of the war. German forces were defending desperately, knowing that once the Allies crossed, Germany's defeat was inevitable. The 761st crossed on March 28, their Shermans rolling onto pontoon bridges under artillery fire. They established a bridgehead, then pushed east into Bavaria. By April 1945, they had been in combat for 145 consecutive days. Captain Johnny Stevens, who'd led Charlie Company since their first engagement at Morville, wrote in his diary, "We've forgotten what fresh air feels like. Men are falling asleep during maintenance. We're operating on instinct, muscle memory from thousands of hours in these tanks. The only thing keeping us going is each other. We can't let our brothers down. We can't prove the Army right by breaking it now." On May 5, 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion liberated Gunskirchen, a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration complex in Austria. Nothing in their training, nothing in their combat experience had prepared them for what they found. Thousands of prisoners, skeletal, dying, barely human. The smell of death so overwhelming that tankers vomited inside their turrets. Bodies stacked like cordwood. Survivors so weak they couldn't stand. Technical Sergeant Johnny Long climbed down from his tank and walked through the camp. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We thought we'd seen the worst humanity had to offer," Long recalled decades later. "We'd seen men blown apart by artillery. We'd seen towns destroyed. We'd seen refugees fleeing with everything they owned on their backs. But this was evil on a scale we couldn't comprehend. And the twisted thing was, we were black soldiers liberating a camp full of people the Nazis considered inferior. We understood that hatred, that dehumanization. We'd lived it in America. We just never imagined it could be industrialized like this." The 761st used their tanks to break open the camp's supply warehouses, distributing food and medical supplies to survivors. They used their radios to call for medical support. They used their weapons to ensure SS guards who hadn't fled couldn't harm anyone else.
They stayed at Gunskirchen for 3 days, helping survivors and bearing witness to Nazi atrocity. Then they got orders to move out. Another mission, another town to liberate. The war was almost over, but not quite. On May 6, 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion fought its last engagement near the town of Steyr, Austria. They'd been in combat for 183 consecutive days. The next day, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The 761st had liberated 30-plus towns and cities across 4 countries. They'd fought in every major engagement in Patton's sector. They'd compiled a combat record that exceeded any comparable unit, white or black. And Patton, in his final address to the battalion, said what he'd never expected to say. "You're the best damn tankers I've ever seen. I'm proud to have commanded you." May 1945. The war was over. The 761st Tank Battalion prepared to return home. They'd survived 183 days of continuous combat. They'd proven everything the Army said was impossible. They'd forced a racist general to acknowledge their excellence. They'd compiled a record that should have made them heroes.
What they got instead was silence. The 761st returned to the United States in late 1945 and early 1946. They expected parades. They expected recognition. They expected America to acknowledge what they'd accomplished. Instead, they found the same segregated nation they'd left, the same colored-only signs, the same second-class citizenship, the same assumptions about black inferiority. Captain David Williams, who'd commanded tanks through some of the fiercest fighting in Europe, was denied service at a restaurant in Virginia because of his skin color. He was wearing his uniform, covered in medals. The waitress looked at his decorations and said, "We don't serve coloreds." Sergeant Warren Creasy, who'd single-handedly destroyed multiple German tanks and saved countless white infantrymen, returned to New York and couldn't rent an apartment in a white neighborhood. Property managers told him the building was whites only. The men who'd fought fascism overseas came home to American apartheid. And the Army, which should have celebrated their achievements, buried them instead. When official histories of World War II were written, the 761st was barely mentioned. When tank tactics were analyzed, their innovations were credited to white units. When Patton's Third Army achievements were documented, the 761st's contributions were erased. It was systematic historical cleansing. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, who died heroically destroying a German roadblock, was recommended for the Medal of Honor by his commanding officer. The Army downgraded it to a Silver Star. The official reasoning? Insufficient documentation. The documentation existed. It was ignored. Lieutenant Charles Thomas, who'd led his tanks against fortified positions while wounded 3 times, was recommended for the Medal of Honor. Downgraded to a Silver Star, same reason. 7 members of the 761st Tank Battalion were recommended for the Medal of Honor between 1944 and 1946. All 7 were denied. All 7 had documentation. All 7 had witness testimony. All 7 were black. The pattern was undeniable. Black soldiers could fight. Black soldiers could die. But black soldiers couldn't be heroes. Not official ones, anyway. For 53 years, this remained the status quo. The 761st veterans grew old. They had reunions, sharing memories with men who understood what they'd endured. They told their grandchildren about the war, about the tanks, about the men they'd lost. But America didn't listen. Then, in 1978, a historian named Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, yes, the basketball player, began researching black soldiers in World War II for a documentary. He discovered the 761st's record and was stunned that he'd never heard of them. Jabbar's documentary, released in 1992, brought the 761st story to a wider audience. Suddenly, people were asking questions. Why hadn't we heard about this? Why weren't these men honored? What happened? The pressure built. Veterans advocates pushed for recognition. Congressional representatives demanded answers. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. In 1997, 53 years after his death, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was finally awarded the Medal of Honor. President Bill Clinton presented it to Rivers' family in a White House ceremony. Rivers' sister, Grace Woodfork, was 82 years old. She accepted the medal and said simply, "My brother died, proving he was as good as any man." It shouldn't have taken 53 years for America to admit. That same year, 6 other members of the 761st received upgraded medals for their heroism. It was too late for most of them. They died without recognition, but their families finally received acknowledgement. In 1978, the 761st Tank Battalion was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest unit award in the military, for their extraordinary heroism. It came 35 years after the war ended. General George S. Patton never lived to see the 761st fully recognized. He died in December 1945, 7 months after the war ended, in a car accident in Germany. But his transformation from racist skeptic to true believer was documented in letters, speeches, and orders he issued during and after the war. In a letter to his wife, written in March 1945, Patton reflected on his experiences with the 761st. "He has forced me to reconsider my opinions about Negro soldiers. The 761st has fought with distinction in every engagement. They have taken casualties that would have broken other units and continued fighting. Their commanders and men display courage equal to any soldiers I have commanded. I was wrong to doubt them. A man's worth is measured by his actions, not his race." It wasn't a full rejection of his racist views. Patton remained a complicated, flawed man until his death. But it was an acknowledgement that combat had challenged his assumptions in ways nothing else could. The 761st had forced a racist general to confront reality. They'd done it with tactics, with courage, with an unbreakable combat record that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Today, at Fort Benning, Georgia, now Fort Moore, there's a monument to the 761st Tank Battalion. It shows a Sherman tank with a Black Panther painted on its hull, the unit's distinctive insignia. Tourists walk past it without understanding what it represents. A memorial to men who fought 2 wars, one against Nazi Germany, another against American racism. In 2005, the surviving members of the 761st, fewer than 20 men by then, all in their 80s, were invited to a ceremony at the Pentagon. The Secretary of the Army formally apologized for the decades of neglect and historical erasure. One veteran, Sergeant E.G. McConnell, age 84, stood to respond. "We didn't fight for recognition. We fought because our country needed us. We fought because men were dying and we had the skills to help. We fought because every mission was proof that the color of our skin had nothing to do with our courage or capability. The recognition is nice, but it doesn't change what we already knew. We were as good as any tankers who ever lived. We proved it in 30 towns across Europe. We proved it to Patton. We proved it to ourselves. That was enough." The audience, military officers, politicians, historians, gave him a standing ovation, but McConnell sat down without acknowledging it. He'd said what needed to be said. The 761st's combat record stands as one of the most remarkable in American military history. 183 consecutive days in combat, longest of any U.S. tank battalion in World War II. 30-plus towns and cities liberated. 4 countries fought through. 6,000-plus miles traveled under combat conditions. 391 enemy tanks and vehicles destroyed. 331 German soldiers killed, thousands captured. 3 Medal of Honor recipients, awarded posthumously, decades later. 1 Presidential Unit citation. But beyond the statistics lies a deeper truth. These men destroyed the lie of black inferiority through undeniable demonstration. Every town they liberated was evidence. Every German tank they destroyed was proof. Every mission completed successfully was an argument that couldn't be refuted. They didn't defeat American racism. That battle continues. But they demolished one pillar of it, the claim that black Americans couldn't be warriors. General George Patton learned this lesson in combat. The German soldiers who faced them learned it in combat. The bomber crews they saved, the infantrymen they supported, the towns they freed, all learned it through direct experience. America took longer, much longer. But the evidence, accumulated over 183 days of perfect combat performance, eventually became impossible to ignore. Today, the U.S. military is integrated. Black Americans serve at every level, in every specialty, from private to general. The 761st helped make that possible, not through politics or persuasion, but through excellence so undeniable that even the most committed racist had to acknowledge it. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers died in 1944, never knowing he'd receive the Medal of Honor. He died believing his nation would never acknowledge his sacrifice.
He died fighting anyway, because that's what warriors do. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, proved that courage knows no color, that excellence transcends prejudice, that warriors are made by training, discipline, and heart, not by the melanin in their skin. They proved it to a skeptical general. They proved it to a racist nation. They proved it in fire and blood across 183 days of combat that should have broken any unit. And they proved it so completely that even 53 years of silence couldn't erase what they accomplished. 30 towns were liberated. 4 countries were freed. 1 general's mind changed. 1 nation's assumptions were challenged. The best damn tankers Patton ever saw. Black, brave, unstoppable.